Hey everybody, it's Brian checking in again on a Sunday afternoon. Hope everyone is well. Had a pretty nice week at the internship at the DC Historical Society. Finally got my hands on some materials. The move is happening, as I've mentioned several times before. My job this week was putting the books on shelves that will actually be in the reading room of the reference library, not in the stacks or high density storage. So we had like 60 boxes of books that were, generally in order in terms of Library of Congress call number. But within the boxes themselves and between the boxes, there were some that were out of order just because of the way the books fit in the boxes. So it was my job to make sure everything was alphabetically organized going onto the shelf. Kind of a tedious process, but also very rewarding for me because I got to kind of get a feel for what our collection is. And I may not be actually working with patrons, as I've mentioned before as well, but I kind of know where the books are and what kinds of books that we have that people might be looking for as patrons. And it was also very cool just to get hands-on history. Like, kind of before this time, it almost felt like a logistics internship because I didn't have any materials in the library. But I got to touch the books this time, like when you're holding the congressional directory from 1840 in your hands. That's when it sort of becomes real that this is actual history, and it's a cool feeling. So that was my job for the week. We also did kind of a cool thing. This is something that patrons would do as they came in, like a house history thing. We did, in the absence of patrons, we did one for myself. So the house I live in DC here was built in 1923, and we have these city directories that are kind of like phone books, but with more information than just address, phone number, stuff like that. So you could look up by address the 1923 city directory, like who was living there, who was the first owner of the house, and you could also find out the address where they worked and the profession they were in. So we looked that up in the way that I would do that for a patron, but just for myself. That's a really cool bit of history to kind of connect with the past. There was Elmer Jones that lived in my house almost 100 years ago now, and he worked on 11th Street, a couple blocks over, and he was in meats. So I learned that, and kind of unique perspective on history and previous residents here. So I thought that was very cool. Moving on to kind of the reading topics for this week. The Historical Society, it's a pretty white organization in terms of ethnicity makeup anyway. We have one black full-time retail member services associate. Aside from that, all the full-time staff is white, and moving beyond that to the board, and it's also pretty extensively white. So that can be sort of, an intimidating or disconcerting thing, I guess. I don't know that. I can imagine that could be the situation for a city that is so historically black to kind of walk into a place about the history of the city that is presenting a pretty white face to it. So I could see that as being somewhat uncomfortable for minority groups. And going beyond that, it's not really a revenue generating thing, the Historical Society of Washington. You can, sell memberships, and there are various book sales and stuff to make money, but a lot of the money coming in is from donors, and that world is also, from what I've seen of it, pretty upper crusty, old and white folks. And, if you are a librarian, person of color, and moving around in that world amongst wealthy donors, it can feel like a different world from the world you're living in. So I could see that as sort of just the kind of ethnic and financial makeup of the people who are providing support for this organization can be maybe a little bit off-putting for certain people. And I don't know a whole lot about what happens behind the scenes, so I could be totally misinformed, but I can only say what I've seen. Like at our opening gala, it was a fairly white, wealthy crowd. So doesn't mean that's the entire story, but that's what I've seen. In terms of accessibility, our building having been renovated in the past, over the course of the last 2 or 3 years, it's pretty modern, and it was done by a pretty progressive company like Apple. So the accessibility issues are built in pretty much all over. I don't think there's too much in the way of accessibility issues that I can see on the face of it, not being aware of all the issues that other people might be experiencing. But as far as like building ADA type of stuff, it seems like it's pretty modern and up to date. So I don't see a whole lot of accessibility issues myself. And as far as providing support for underrepresented groups, I haven't worked in the field really much at all, so I don't have a great answer for this, but I know there's kind of like niche Twitter groups for librarians that people can support themselves, and I think that's a great way to kind of have a conversation about things that might make you uncomfortable with people that aren't your boss, and just people that are maybe experiencing the same thing. I think that's very valuable. And within the workplace, I think it's just good to have a place for open dialogue where if someone's feeling uncomfortable, they don't feel they need to hide it or be afraid to speak their mind. So creating an environment where those views are welcomed is probably the best thing. I will see you guys later. Have a nice Sunday.